So let's go. We're going to pick up right in the middle of Ruth 2, and verse 10 is officially where we left off last time, and that's where we'll begin tonight. But pray with me first before we start. Father, thank you for the time we get to spend in your word, and as we seek understanding, we pray that you would give it by your Spirit, and that not only would we know more about this story and the text of your word when we leave, as when we showed up, but that you would somehow use it to form us and to impact our lives so that we could be better witnesses for you and help others. So guide our study tonight and our discussion in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. So we're right in the middle of, this is the chapters break down pretty well into like a 4-act story. Chapter 2 is obviously the second act, and it's split into 3 scenes, let's say. Think of it again like a literary or a movie understanding of it. And right in the middle here, in verse 10, you will have Ruth responding to Boaz's sort of striking kindness to her, right? So going back to the previous few verses, in verse 8, when he spoke to her, he tells her, don't go to any other field. You don't even need to look at any other field. Stay in this field. And that's more than just a generous gesture. That is probably Boaz knowing this. If you keep this field search going on, there's trouble waiting for you. Right? A pretty young woman shouldn't be skipping around the fields during this era of Israel's history, and he seems to know that. So just don't go anywhere else. Not only that, but just stay by he uses this word, stick close to my female servants, my young women. Which is like, he doesn't have to do that. If all she's there for is food, she can go get the food. And that's like bare minimum, pretty nice guy. She went out for food, she found food, and he allowed her to get food. So also stay by my young women. Also, I'm declaring, we mentioned this last time, I'm declaring that none of the men around here should bother you. They shouldn't touch you, they shouldn't harass you. He's going to go above and beyond to protect her, not only physically, right, that she doesn't get assaulted, but actually to add in a couple of comments here that she should not even be harassed. She shouldn't even be made to feel embarrassed. It's really extraordinary, and I won't uncover all of the nuances of language there, but it's just layering on protection and affection and kindness to her. And not only that, but when you're thirsty, just go to where my male servants have the water, and just drink from their vessels anytime you feel like it. I don't know if that's normal or not. I'm assuming not. But you can see what he's doing. He's going to great lengths to bring her in as if she's getting very special treatment here. And the thing is, Ruth is aware of this. So verse 10 is where we pick up, and she is just overcome, it appears. So verse 10, she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" It's the first time in the story that anyone has spoken directly to her as an individual in a conversation that they initiated, right? Even when Naomi in chapter 1 has addressed Ruth, most of that was addressing her with her sister-in-law. It's Ruth and Orpah, and they're like a unit, they're like a team. She's just addressing them, and it's in the capacity of these girls who are with me. She doesn't even really address her directly, and in those conversations that they do speak directly, it's Ruth who initiates it, right, at the beginning of this chapter. I'm going to go out and I'm going to see if I can find a field and find someone in whose eyes I might find grace. So this is the first time anyone has spoken to her directly in a conversation that she did not initiate, and it's really the first time she's been acknowledged at all. Every other encounter, she's either been ignored, just almost fades into the background, or she's talked about as a Moabite, right? And it's like the servant, Boaz's servant in the last section, is the main example. He sounds as if he's really trying to pile on scorn, because when Boaz asks about who is this, or to whom is this young woman, his response is kind of like, oh yeah, she's the twice in two breaths he says he uses the word Moabite. That's a tip-off that he doesn't think much of Moabites, and he doesn't think much of her, and he thinks that the boss is going to be upset because he allowed a Moabite in, and we talked about that, how it looks like mid-sentence he realizes, uh-oh, Boaz is not angry that a Moabite is here, he's starting to look angry with me for speaking about this woman this way, and that's why his sentence just trails off, and in Hebrew it just doesn't make any, it's an incoherent sentence. So it looks like here at the end of that, Boaz has just decided, you know what, forget this guy, I'm just gonna talk to her directly. And that's where you have his kindness being poured out, and she recognizes this and appreciates it. But it's the first time. She's obviously at this point unaccustomed to having anyone care about her, show any favor to her at all. So much so that when she replies to Boaz, and a lot of this, she bows down. It's the Hebrew word for worship, but it can just be used to be, this means she fell on her face or on her knees or something like that. It's a gestural way. It's a physical way of posturing your body to show respect and submission. She's putting her entirely in his care, if you will, because that seems to be what he's offering. But she's also showing tremendous respect that he has so honored her that she doesn't want to be presumptuous about it. But there's a funny little interchange here in this just short little response in verse 10. Falls on her face, bows to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Remember, she's amazed at two things. One, that she's found grace in somebody's eyes. But you remember, in the beginning of this chapter, that's exactly what she said. That's her precise language to Naomi. I think I will go and see if I can find grace in somebody's eyes. So there's this funny little irony that unfolds here. The very thing she set out to do, she's surprised when she finds it. I'm going to go see if I can find grace, find some man in whose grace in whose eyes I'll find grace. Then she finds exactly that, and she's sort of amazed that she found it. So, it's a little ironic, and I think a clever little humor built into the story, but it also seems to have a profound meaning behind it, right? That fits with the way that the story is told, that the narrator presents events in the book of Ruth, which is to say, there's no predetermined path for how things must take place, right? There are certain things that have to take place for the story to even work. So there's a certain narrative certain things that have to happen for the narrative to work. But it's not predetermined how they must happen. So even when Ruth, in this tremendous act of boldness, maybe faith, hopeful, optimism, whatever, she says, I think I'm going to go out and see if I can find grace in someone's eyes. Then it happens, precisely that happens. She finds grace in someone's eyes, and she's like, whoa, I didn't expect that. It's like, wait, as the reader, as you're hearing this story, you're like, well, wait, isn't that precisely what we were supposed to expect? But she didn't expect it. Or if she did, she's still somehow able to be surprised when it happens and how it happens. And it's just another one of these little storytelling details that make this story work, but it also adds texture to it where it doesn't work along a sort of path of certainty that's predetermined. The course of events are not predetermined from the perspective of the characters walking through this story. They're just like, and that's a nice little detail that I thought. And another part of that is, the second thing that surprises her is, wait a minute, why are you showing me grace when I am a foreigner? And the way she says this is really clever. And there's a little, what Dr. Mike Heiser used to call a grammar spasm. So forgive me the grammar spasm here, but this is a really interesting little bit. The word that's used for to recognize somebody. That's what she says. Why have you recognized me? Taking notice of me, or to. So the word to recognize, or the verb to be recognized or to recognize, is nahir, and the word for a foreigner is nocher. It's the same root. It sounds the same. They're spelled almost the same, and it seems there's a wordplay intended here. Why have you? And it looks like they're related actually in the meaning, where a foreigner is a nochri, and it seems like you call someone a nochri, a foreigner, because they're recognizable in a specific sense. So it's a little bit of a stretch, so stay with me. But if someone is walking around in the community and they look recognizably different from everyone else, right? Probably by their manner of dress, or maybe hairstyle, or skin color, like all kinds of identifiable features that could set someone apart as a outsider, right? A foreigner. It looks like there's a sort of link between the verb that leads to the meaning of the noun, right? So someone who's a nochri, a foreigner, seems to be called that because there's something identifiable about them that causes everyone who's local to recognize them, right? So you've probably all lived in places or been a foreigner visiting places and know sort of how this could work. It looks like there's like a verbal link between these two terms. And it's interesting here that it's used in Ruth's mouth. She says, why have you given recognition to me in the way that you have? Because, right, why have you nahard me? Because I'm a nochri. And it's a clever little bit, but when you think about it, it's actually a lot of layers to this. So the most famous example of where the interchange of this type of vocabulary works is in the Joseph story. So first of all, Joseph's brothers, remember they throw him in the pit, and what do they bring to his father to convince him that he's dead? The coat, the bloody coat, bloody garment, and they're like, hey, and they use this vocabulary. Do you recognize this? And of course he does, and it's interesting, and I get this from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who's passed away just pretty recently, but was a really, really insightful teacher of the Hebrew Bible, and I stole this directly from him, so I just want to credit that. But he says what they do there is they use an act of recognition as a form of deception. It's just a clever little bit. And then later in the story of Joseph and his brothers, it's in chapter 42, it's almost precisely matches. When Joseph saw his brothers, right? Joseph recognized his brothers. He saw his brothers, and it says, and he recognized them. It's the same word we have in the book of Ruth, and it's the same word that his brothers used to deceive his father. They bring the garment to Jacob, and they say, do you recognize this? Later in the same story, he sees them, he recognizes them, and the ESV translates it as something like, he treated them as strangers. But the way that reads in Hebrew is he recognized them, but then he recognized them. It just repeats the same word in a different way. And it's meant to be something like he recognized them, but he made himself unrecognizable to them. So you see how it kind of just plays, Hebrew does this a lot. And he's almost reversing what had happened previously, where they use recognition to deceive, and he's using it in a strange way. It almost seems to withhold information, right? Because he doesn't want them to know who he is just yet. But the process that Joseph is using is going to actually reunite them. And it's just this sort of clever and brilliant little wordplay that's at work. And it looks like there's something similar going on here. So, in order to make himself appear as a stranger, he does what they did to Jacob. But he does that precisely because he recognized them. So it cascades down over itself, and it's really interesting. And it looks to me like something's going on here in Ruth that is picking up a similar thing. She has to remind Boaz, I am a foreigner, I am a nochri, I'm the stranger, I'm the foreigner. But she, in doing so, acknowledges, what you have done for me is giving me recognition. However, it's another irony. why are strangers normally recognized? Why do you normally recognize foreigners? Oh, for something that makes them different, and therefore usually suspect, or right, marked as an outsider. What has Boaz done? He has taken notice of her. He has given her recognition in a way that makes her welcome in. It's almost the opposite of what the words should mean. And it's another one of these beautiful little touches that is just sort of, again, cascades down on itself, and in a couple of turns of phrase, it proclaims something profound that's happening. She is the ultimate foreigner, a Moabite. And everyone who so far in the story has seen her has recognized her for her foreign status, but Boaz has recognized her, and that act of recognition has brought her in some way that makes her no longer treated as a foreigner. And it's just this little potent bit of storytelling. And all this you get out of these little turns of phrase. So I'm sorry again for the grammar spasm, but to point these things out, I think really enriches the story. It adds texture, and it makes you see the sort of poetic style of the story and how it's told. Tracy, go ahead.
So when Joseph and when in Hebrew they use basically recognize twice.
Right in a row,
Are
yes.
one of those recognize and bring his brothers in?
At first, no, it's the opposite. But my point was in the flow of the story, the point will be to bring them in. He will be the one who reunites them. But at this stage, he is using his recognition of them, but their non-recognition of him to keep them at arm's length in order to further test them and challenge them, and you know how that story goes. So yes, but it's a wordplay that will lead to a reunion, a bringing together. But at that point, he is doing to them what they did to him in a way, using recognition as a device to separate. But in Joseph's case, it is only temporary separation, and ultimately what he's doing, he seems to have a plan there, and what he ultimately does is he unites them, he brings them together. With Boaz and Ruth's feeling of recognition in Boaz's eyes, it's almost all to unify. It's almost all bringing them together. There is no sense in which she, in every step he takes to acknowledge her, she becomes more and more brought into the covenant people and brought in under his care and brought into the love and acceptance that he is exemplifying throughout this story. So, yeah, it's good. The Joseph story was something we could talk much longer about, but I was just trying to run through that as an example. But it's worth reading that again and thinking about what's going on there because it is very clever. Okay. So verse 11, we have Boaz's response back to her. And this is, how many different translations? I usually have up here the ESV. Anybody have an NIV or New American or King James, something along the lines? How does verse 11 start?
Boaz replied.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband.
Yeah.
How you left your father and mother.
Okay, good. And most translations just do that. So what you have here in Hebrew is you have two words, actually, for it literally says, Boaz answered, and he said to her. It's two separate words for his reply. Most English translations just try to smooth that out because it's another one of these strange redundancies that sounds very awkward when you say it. And he replied, and he said to her. Wait a minute, which? But in Hebrew, it seems to be intentional. So just another note that sometimes to smooth out in English, the way it sounds in English, you actually miss or skip something. And it actually does read in Hebrew that, and Boaz answered, and he said to her. And this is a mystery. It's like, well, what's the point of that? And it's not totally clear, but what it looks like is the word for answer is actually a term that I have found very often is used for a public declaration or to give testimony in sometimes in a legal case. It can be a legal term of art or a term of jurisprudence where if you are called to say as a witness in a legal case, what you're doing there is you're giving testimony. That's the first word, and it looks like what this means to say is that Boaz is making a public declaration of some sort. We talked about this a bit last time with his previous statement. So he answered, and that term is used, it's meant for public consumption. He's making a declaration for all to hear. He is serving in this context as a public witness on Ruth's behalf. And he seems to be very deliberate about doing that. And he said, is him just, again, speaking to Ruth. So there's there's layers to the dynamic of what's going on here. And again, he has an interest in publicly standing up for her character. And you could see from the context why that would be so necessary. But Boaz, let's say, testified, and he said, all right, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. That language, by the way, is almost exactly from Genesis 12. You leave your father and mother and your native land. First person to do that, Abraham. And it, to me, cannot be coincidence that Boaz uses that language to describe Ruth. When an Israelite ancient reader hears those things, right, you have left your father, mother, and native land, and not think of Abraham. This is one of the essential, central beginnings of Israel's story is Abraham leaving his father and mother and his native land and going to the place that God would show him. This is central to the covenant story. So it's very hard for me to believe that that's not intentionally put in there. And what that tells me is that Ruth is presented, think about this, Ruth, the ultimate foreigner, the Moabite, who has now decided to join herself to the people of Israel, to the God of Israel, to join the covenant, is acting like Abraham, the originator of the covenant, right? She is a sort of new Abraham in a way. She's walking in the footsteps of Abraham. Not only that, but she is the one, she's the very one. It is her choice to walk that path that will be the means by which the covenant people receive their ultimate king. So, you follow me then? She is sort of metaphorically Abraham in the story, and then she is literally biologically going to be the one who carries forward Abraham's promises through King David and ultimately through Jesus the Messiah. It's sort of an unbelievable little thing when you notice it. Wait, the importance of those words, of that path that she walks, the parallel between Abraham and Ruth is hard to overstate. But Boaz just throws it into this statement like, oh yeah, you're the Abraham type of walker, right? And you can start to think about the significance of this when you hear it the way, say, Paul will talk about those who are of the faith of Abraham, right, in Galatians and in Romans. Abraham is the model of faithfulness and allegiance to the one true God, to Yahweh, in the selection, when you have the choice of all the other gods of the nations. And the one in this story who most walks the path of Abraham and who literally will carry the Abrahamic covenant forward into God's people via David is the Moabite who left her gods in Moabite and her father and mother in Moab and came to join the people of Israel and to follow their God and show allegiance to him. It's, again, in a short, dense little speech that should just be a nice little speech. It really packs a lot of theology. So, the Lord repay you. May Yahweh repay you for what you have done, and may a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. That phrase, coming under the wings, we're going to get to in chapter 3. Just make a register of it in your mind that Boaz is the first one to use it. And how is he using it? May you be repaid by Yahweh. May Yahweh repay your what you have done. because you've come to take refuge under his wings. And, spoiler, but in the next chapter, Ruth is going to approach Boaz and ask Boaz, hey, cover me under your wings. So there's this funny thing that happens, and this happens a lot of times in the story. I'm pointing out some of them, but you'll want to read and listen to more of them. This thing that happens where a character in the story will make a statement of what they hope will happen or what they're declaring will happen or something like that. May this happen. And then they will be the ones to make it happen in a very short period of time. Happens all the time. And this is a good example of it. So just a hint, and sorry for the spoiler, but Boaz will be the one who actually brings her in under his wings. But the language here blends what he will do with what he hopes Yahweh should do to Ruth. And that's only one link, and we'll get to more, where the way Boaz functions in the story is very often as a stand-in for Yahweh. Yahweh's action is not explained in the story. He seems to not be active in the story. But if you're paying close attention, there are ways where it looks like he is, only it's through Boaz that he's active. And this is one of those little places where that happens. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken to the heart of your servant, though I am not even one of your servants. See, this back and forth here. This is almost like what Paul says, where they're trying to outdo each other in honor and showing honor to each other, right? This little dialogue is really beautiful, the back and forth. So, may I continue to find favor, or I have found favor, which, remember, was the very thing she set out to do, right? I'm going to go see if I can find grace, chen in Hebrew, find favor in someone's eyes. And then she's like, oh, well, I have, or I hope I continue to. This is amazing. She's absorbing the reality of what's going on here. Goodness, I could. She hasn't seen any favor for a long time, is the point. What grace has this woman had in her life since at least her husband's death? And now all of a sudden she just seems to be, awash in it, and it's not lost on her. The reality is sort of embedding itself into her consciousness. There's a little phrase here in Hebrew that reads, you have spoken to the heart of your servant. That's literally how it reads. Won't get into it now, but it's very curious that the previous place in the Hebrew Bible that this phrase is used is back in Judges chapter 19. And I mentioned this, I think, in week 1 or a couple weeks ago. This is the story of the Levite who has this concubine who leaves and goes back to her father's house. And that whole, literally the worst story in Judges, and probably the most horrible story in the whole Bible, where he goes to retrieve her, basically. But then when he gets her, they get, basically there's a replay of the Sodom and Gomorrah, the story of Sodom, and these men come to the door and they want to basically sexually abuse the men who have taken lodging in this house for the night. And instead, they just shove this concubine out there, and they physically abuse her and rape her all night, and then she dies the next day. He cuts her up into pieces and sends her off to the 12 tribes and try to rally to the cause. Hey, look what they've done. We got to do something. And it's ironically the first time in the book of Judges that the tribes actually unite to do anything, because that's the point. A lot of the point of Judges is to show that they're disunited the whole time. After Joshua, they were supposed to bind together and unite as a nation under the leadership of Judah, tribe of Judah. And not only does that not happen, but it just keeps disintegrating. And this is the one display of unity that they can muster. It's like we have to avenge this concubine, this woman who was abused and killed. And the whole point is we can unite if it's about revenge. Right? So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to go into the Judges riff, but when he sets off after this concubine to get her back, his explanation for that is, I'm going to go speak to her heart to bring her home. It's a sweet way of saying what he's apparently trying to do, but there's nothing about the story that makes you believe he actually did that or cared to do that in the first place. It's almost like a meaningless phrase. And it's just a little curiosity that that's the phrase that shows up here. What it looks like is another way where Ruth, the story of Ruth, and Ruth herself and Boaz as a sort of team are taking the stories that preceded them and reversing them. They're correcting, they're repairing it all. So Boaz here is actually the one who speaks to the heart of this estranged woman who is threatened and in all sorts of jeopardy. And it's like, again, the repair of that story. And it's just a little note that's like, well, that's worth rereading again and thinking about what's going on here. And there's a Hebrew Bible scholar named Jenny Matheny who points this out. She's got a whole book that I can't afford, but she's explained it. And no, scholarly books get crazy sometimes. So, but I've looked into it, and I've heard her sort of explain this in lectures and stuff. And she's got a real clever take on this. But she sees this precisely as that. The story of Ruth is an answer to the devastation and disloyalty in the book of Judges. And this is one of those little phrases that you find that happening. And it's really brilliant. So what doesn't happen in Judges, what decidedly does not happen, Ruth and Boaz show happening in very simple ways, but in very deep ways, right? So he actually speaks to her heart, and he's given her nourishment, he's offered her protection, and he's maybe above all showing her honor and really giving her the affection that nobody in the book of Judges gets, but certainly women can't expect to find. So you have spoken to the heart of your servant, even though I am not even sort of worthy to be called one of your servants. She is the one who lowers herself. She knows she's not even reached the level of one of his servants, one of his female servants. And this is a word for servant that is like not a servant who has any rights. It's not even a concubine. Well, we'll get to this again in the next chapter. But she's just saying, I'm not even low enough to be one of your lowest servants. And yet, here you are speaking to my heart. It's just an astonishing little interchange. So, that's their dialogue. And then there's apparently some intervening time, and then verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here. And it's literally it has a pretty formal tone, this term. Approach. You see this in terms of royal settings or like official settings where you'd be beckoned to appear, or you would need to get permission before you could come near. And that's the term that's used here. So it's just an interesting little note. Approach and eat some of the bread, and you will dip your morsel in the vinegar. There's a very formal introduction to this invitation to a meal. So it's an interesting thing. I'm not going to dwell too long on it. But this whole meal, to me, takes on a rather formal, almost liturgical tone. It seems to me like something is very intentionally happening with this meal. And there are literary types who will say anytime you're reading a story and you see a meal, a communal meal, you should pay attention. It's very often a transformation is about to take place. And, so I'm not a literary scholar, so I couldn't say for sure. But it does seem to be a good sort of setting, a sort of type scene for when you see a communal meal, an invitation like this. It usually is setting off something of importance. A transformation in the story somehow. So I think that makes sense. But to me, it just reads very, Boaz he's giving instructions. You can see his authority. He's in a position of authority, and he's telling her, here's what you will do. At the same time, it's not bossing her around. It's an invitation. So it's this meal to show her honor by including her in it. But it also, to me, takes on a bit of almost a bit of a liturgical or ritual tone to it. Right? On the surface, it just looks like, well, this is when they break for lunch, and they're all working out there, and they sit down and they have a meal, and here's some bread, and here's some wine. It's vinegar is the word. They're not drinking wine, I don't think, but it's like, dipping your bread in vinegar. It's a simple meal. It's a humble meal. It's just roasted grain and bread. It just looks like a lunch break, but the way it's told, to me, has the feel of something of an official a communal meal, almost like a covenant meal. That'd probably be a stretch a little bit too far, but it's hard for me to look at it and the way it's presented and not think a little bit of the Lord's Supper feel to it. Right? I don't know that we're supposed to read it that far, but it's got some unusual details in the way it's sort of formalized. But in any case, beyond the formality of it and what might be there liturgically or ritually, the fact, first of all, that he invites her to this meal, it's already out of the ordinary. And then the way he goes about it. She sat beside the reapers, and he passed, it's like he pinched, like scooped up grain. It's very, I don't know, it's another one of those physical acts that makes it sound like something important's happening here. It's hard to translate, but it looks like he picked it up and he served it to her. You know, it sounds simple enough, but like, remember, he's the Lord of this whole manor. Right? He's the boss. This is not the kind of thing I think you typically have the boss doing, even for his workers. You'd think he'd have servants doing this stuff for him. And this is another reason that it rings to me of the Lord's Supper, of communion. Jesus, not just like inviting his disciples to the Lord's Supper, but then doing the stuff that the servants should be doing. It's got that ring to it to me. Could I prove that? Would I make a sermon out of that? Probably not. And maybe it's just a sensibility, and that's not the meaning of the story, but he scoops up this roasted grain, and you almost necessarily have to lean to her, hand it, put it in her hand. It's a very close, embodied, almost intimate way of acting. And it just strikes me as highly unusual and probably very deliberate on Boaz's part. And it just seems to me to reflect an intimacy that I can't read as accidental. So, in any case, he hands her the roasted grain, passes it to her. She ate until she was satisfied, and she left some over. Possibly she just had enough, or possibly, knowing Ruth, she ate just enough to where she was satisfied, and then she intentionally left some over because she's going to bring that back to Naomi. Which is just another little character detail of the kinds of things Ruth might do. She's already thinking about her mother-in-law, because that's partly why she set out on this adventure in the first place. Okay. When she rose to glean, verse 15, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her. Oh, and also, pull out even from some of the bundles for her, and just leave those there for her to glean those too. And do not rebuke her." This is just, it's an example again of, in the Torah, you have laws explaining that you have to leave the corners of your field for the poor, for the orphan, for the widow, etc. And when you're going, making your first pass to harvest, and some gets left behind, just leave it. Don't go back and gather all of it up to maximize the profit. Leave it for the poor. Those are basically your two requirements in the Torah if you're harvesting. And Boaz is like, he's going so far above that it's clear he cares about and knows very, with some detail, what the Torah says you're supposed to do. But then it's clear he doesn't care to stop there. He's like, not only that, just let her gather up even what you guys are gathering. And then, you know what, just on accident, leave her these bundles. So it's a superabundance of generosity that, you know, he's making it very obvious.
It sounds like he's courting.
That's an interesting question. That is certainly a possible reading, that he is interested in not just showing her kindness because this is the kind of man Boaz is. He is a man of chayil, a man of virtue. And this is how a man of virtue who cares about the Torah treats foreigners and you know, people in need. It is also possible that on top of that, he is interested in her in a way that he can't quite articulate out loud yet because it wouldn't be appropriate, and because of her position and his position, and it's just not, that's going to have to clarify itself. But I think you're on to an interesting line of thought, which is, could he also be hopeful that this could be a romantic connection at some point? And there's reasons to think he maybe doesn't have that in mind yet, but I do think it's possible. And in any case, that is definitely in the background here, because we know where the story's going, and it will lead to a marriage, or otherwise this, again, the food, the grain, the bread in this story is a solution to the first problem in chapter 1, the lack of food. But it's only really symbolic of the real conflict in the plot, which is the lack of children. And to resolve that one, you don't just need generosity and a wealthy man who can afford to give to the poor. You need a husband. And so that's what he's going to become. And it seems to me these are merging together, but how much he's motivated by, hey, maybe, I don't know. I couldn't say for sure at that point. But it's an interesting thought and a smart observation.
Is he also thinking of Ruth? I mean, Naomi?
I believe so, but we'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. It's a very hard question to answer as to what is the relationship exactly between Boaz and Naomi. They never meet or speak directly in the story. Almost seems like they are meant not to. And it's a very unusual dynamic. And they seem to never have anything to do with one another directly. But it's clear at many points, Boaz is acting on her behalf. He's aware of her, cares something about her, but it's just never explained, and it's mysterious, and I don't have a good answer for it at this point, but we will come back to that. He does seem to be acting on Naomi's behalf as much as on Ruth's behalf directly. So very good observation. Okay, so what you have to this point is just tremendous excess of charity and generosity on Boaz's part, but it's not pure charity. Look at verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she hoisted it up, is the way it reads in Hebrew. It's a big load. And then went into the city. So what Ruth now has to do to acquire all this generous blessing is some really hard work, right? It's like this combination of generosity and charity on Boaz's part, and really hard work and industriousness on Ruth's part. So we might think of, well, you do charity and you give to the poor, and this is what it looks like. But at the same time, it's interesting that Ruth is not passive. She still has, yes, she's not passive. She has to do something for this. She works hard. She has to hoist this load up, and scholars estimate this is something like 25, 30 pounds of grain. She's got a big load to carry here. We don't know how far, but like this is a fair amount of work. So I think it's a pretty good example of how the Torah does work to bring together charity to the poor and to those in need, and it's just God's people should be abundantly generous. But also, if you don't create a bond there that then makes a mutual relational dynamic begin to exist, that then brings the other person into being an active participant in this grace, you've just obligated them to maybe feel guilty for receiving all this stuff. And it's just interesting to me that that's how it works here, the social dynamic at work. And if someone just gets pure charity, sometimes that feels like, feel guilty. It makes you feel obligated. And this works to actually counteract that in a really interesting way. So in any case, she's not just like, okay, thanks, you can deliver that to my mother-in-law's house, right? No, she's got to hoof it a little bit. She's got to work for this. Interesting. So she goes into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. So there's a couple of different, there's two types of food at work here. Some is the grain that will become food for them. That's the longer, like medium and longer term. They'll be able to get at least a few weeks, I think, of food out of this, of meals out of this grain. But also there's the food she brought home from lunch. She saved this roasted grain and some bread so Naomi could eat it. That's a more immediate care for her mother-in-law directly. And so there's two things at work here. And it's interesting, Naomi actually asks two questions. Verse 19. Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? And those sound like they should be the same question. Right? It's another curious, it's just the vocabulary is odd. It's not totally clear what she's getting at here, why the two questions, but it could be, what was the source of this barley, that you're packing in, and where did you get this food for lunch, right? It could just be as simple as that. I don't know for sure. There's also a little bit of a wordplay with where. The word for where is very similar to the word for the amount of the ephah, right? Ephah is how you say where, and she just said she had an ephah of barley, so that's possible too, but I don't know what to make of that at this point. But in any case, Naomi's a little bit astonished. Where did all this come from? And where did it come from? Who gave it to you? And right? If Ruth was surprised when she set out to find grace, and then she found grace, Naomi was not expecting this at all. I suspect Naomi thought this is a bad idea, but go ahead, right? Back in the beginning of chapter 2. But she's, at this point, blown away. And not just by the food, but as we keep reading. Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, and I'm pausing because it's actually funny, it's almost like a dramatic pause, right? Blessed be the man. And then she said, and what's the first thing you think you're going to hear? Well, his name, right? And this happens a couple times. It happened already once, but this is almost more dramatic. Again, the way it is almost intentionally worded. The man's name with whom I work today. This sentence is already too long, right? Boaz, right? It saves his name for the very end of the sentence. It's like what she wants to know is, hey, who gave you this bread, and what's going on? And all she has to say is a guy named Boaz, but she doesn't, right? It's another one of these, like, it's almost like a screenplay, or it seems to me a dramatic tension. The man's name with whom I work today is. Am I making too much out of that? Maybe, but I've read this very carefully, very many times, and I'm always struck by, like, why say it that way? And here's Naomi's response. This now Naomi, I think for the first time, is going to begin to be transformed. Right? Naomi's the only character in this story who actually transforms, who actually has any personal growth or like character arc. Everyone else is just steady as they go, that nothing really changes in their own sort of personal character or things like that. Right? It's one of the ways you find out who's the protagonist of a story. Well, usually the one who is the most transformed by the end of it. There's no question in this story that that's Naomi. Right? We think of the hero of the story as Boaz. But, first of all, I could equally propose that Ruth is also the hero of the story. She's every bit the match for Boaz in heroic words and deeds. But that doesn't even make the case that either one of them are the main characters of the story. They are not. I'm going to argue it's Naomi who's the main character. She's the protagonist of the story. And this may be the first time where she actually begins to turn toward hope. There's a slight transformation that takes place here. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Right, so lots just been said there. May he be blessed by Yahweh. And this is another sense of, it's actually very, it's ambiguous when you read it. May he be blessed by Yahweh, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Who is the subject of this sentence? Right? Whose kindness are we talking about? He is Boaz, who Naomi wishes blessings from Yahweh, and it's Yahweh who's the immediate, right? Who's the most immediate name attached to the kindness, and it's not clear. It's one of those ambiguities that, as I said last week, when you see an ambiguity like this, I am almost certain it's intentional. So whose kindness are we supposed to be thinking about here? Yahweh's or Boaz's? And you've been paying attention for a few weeks, you know my answer is yes. Yes, you're supposed to be thinking of Boaz as the agent of Yahweh's kindness. And they cannot be separated, right? In other words, Boaz shows this kindness only as an extension of Yahweh's kindness. And there's no way for Yahweh does not drop down into the story, right, in a supernatural cloud of a pillar of fire and smoke and show kindness. He does it through human choices, human agency. So it's just, again, catch these little details and you really see the power of the story built into it. He has not withheld his kindness to the living or the dead. This gets to one of the sort of essential, one of the greatest good deeds, mitzvahs in Judaism to this day is kindness to the dead. They call it chesed shelamet. Chesed being a word that cannot be translated simply as kindness, but it's impossible to translate chesed into any English analog. It means too much. But kindness gets very close to, very often, what chesed is pointing out. But it's kindness, it's chesed that is true chesed. And what they mean by that is because to do a kind deed to the dead, whether that's how you care for a body who is deceased, or whether it is showing, in this case, honor to the husband, to Machlon, the husband of Ruth, who has died, and by extension, possibly also to Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, to show honor to someone who's no longer here, or to care for their body, as you see, is very important in Judaism, like the disciples care for Jesus' body. This is a very big deal. And it's hard in a culture that does a lot of just like, well, when they're gone, they're gone. Like, no, their body is still here, and that's very important in biblical thinking. And one of the reasons is because to show that gratuitous kindness is to show chesed to somebody who cannot possibly repay it. And that is part, among other reasons, why it's considered such a good deed. And part of why Naomi recognizes here, my goodness, what he's done, whether she's talking about Yahweh or Boaz, what has been done here is an honor that cannot possibly be repaid, right? Because the dead are not here to repay it. And every good deed, every hesed, every act of kindness and generosity always has the possible downside of making someone feel obligated to repay it. Right? And it seems like that shouldn't be, but it is, right? This is how humans operate. And so this phrase, he's shown kindness to the living, that is to us, but also to the dead, is a very big deal. And so you can see her response here has that impact beneath just, hey, we need food and we've got food now. She seems to recognize that what's happened here is something much deeper than that. And also, by the way, the man is close to us. He's a karov. He's a near relative. One of our goelim. A goel is a Hebrew term for redeemer. And we'll have to get into this more next week. I don't want to go too much time into it tonight. But this is the thing that seems to have Naomi the most excited. He qualifies, he's sort of legally qualified to perform redemption, let's say. I'll have to explain how redemption fits into this story next week because it's actually a little complicated. The typical reasons you would have redemption as a possibility usually have to do with land, right? Someone becomes impoverished and their land has to be sold off or they lose it and then it gets the tribal allotment is lost, and land is supposed to stay with the family that inherits it in Israelite legislation. And if that happens, it's possible that a close relative can purchase it back or take action to retrieve it and bring it back into the family inheritance. It's interesting that Naomi is so excited about his status as a goel, but it's like, all right, well, we haven't heard anything about the land this far, right? Other than they left it when the story first begins in chapter 1. But we're not totally clear. Is she thinking, oh good, we can get our land back, or we can get a means of income restored? Chapter 3 is going to lead us in a totally different direction. It doesn't seem like the land is a big deal, right? What she seems to think is like, what she does is she hatches a plan to get a husband for Ruth. It's a little unclear, but the prospect of a goel is really the key point for Naomi at this point. he's a close relative, he's qualified as a redeemer. And in verse 21 has a Ruth's response to Naomi, and this is a little funny. Ruth the Moabite said, so she's getting excited too, but this gets a little, it's a little unclear. Besides, or like, he even said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And you'll notice probably that that's precisely not what Boaz said to do, right? He did not say, stay by my young men.
Yeah.
He seems to think that would have been a bad idea. He told his young men, don't go near this woman, right? Leave her alone. And he specifically told her, and the pronouns here are clear. Stick with my young women. And it's not totally clear to me, has Ruth gotten confused? Did she not? It's just not, it's a little bit strange. I wonder, my best explanation, my stab at this, is that Ruth seems to have thought what Boaz was offering with all of this attention was the prospect that, hey, just, stick around, and what I'll do is I'll set you up with one of my young men, right? I know you need a husband. That seems to be in the background here. She seems to have come away with the impression that, hey, I might be able to get to marry one of these guys. Does that make sense? I don't know for sure, but she seems confused because there's no sense in which Boaz told her to stay by the young men. And Naomi corrects her. Verse 22. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. She directly challenges what Ruth just said. No, that's a bad idea. Don't hang around those young men. Stick with his young women, which is what Boaz in fact said, right? So Boaz and Naomi are aligned in their advice. They have said the same thing, and it's stay with the young women. But Ruth seems to be confused. We're not sure. I suspect maybe she thought, hey, he's going to hook me up with one of his servants as a husband. And that got her, she thought that's pretty good. And he's got so much more in mind, as we already mentioned, maybe she just can't fathom that, or why would he want to marry me? Why would that work? It's a total social mismatch. Rich, wealthy, powerful landowners like this don't just marry servants that aren't even servants. They're the ones that depend on the servants to glean in the field. So it's not totally clear, but it's as good a theory as I can come up with. Ruth is confused because she thinks she's going to be set up with one of these young guys, but that's not at all the plan here as it's going to play out. So Naomi corrects her, and to Ruth's credit, she listens to Naomi. Right? It's good that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you'll be assaulted. So, verse 23, she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. That's Hag Shavuot. That's the actual day of Pentecost when the wheat harvest is completed. And she lived with her mother-in-law. She continued living there. They've now got enough food for presumably up until about the end of the wheat harvest, at which time it seems like she's going to keep working, keep gleaning in the fields, and keep harvesting, coming home with. So their food problem is solved. By the end of chapter 2, the first major plot conflict of lack of food, solved. Through the kindness of Boaz, the chesed of Boaz and of Yahweh, and you settle into this good feeling. Naomi finally seems to be hopeful about something. Ruth is, for the first time, they seem to be actually growing closer together. That is Ruth and Naomi. In fact, when Naomi addresses her, when she explains to Ruth, the man is a close relative of ours, that's the first time you've heard that language, right? Usually Naomi is, it's like, you girls should go back there, to your family, to your God, to your mother's house, to your gods. All of a sudden, Naomi seems to be, again, she's changed a little bit. Who is this? Who is this us, right? So you can see the boldness of Ruth at the beginning of this chapter. I'm going to set out, I'm going to find grace in someone's eyes, and I'm just going to do it. Naomi seems to be the least hopeful of anyone that that's going to work out. But by the end of the chapter, Naomi is the one that's most transformed and seems to have a spark of hope ignited, and it's really has been resolved. And in chapter 3, we're going to see the pattern of chapter 2 replay, only the roles all get switched around, right? So you have this, chapter 2 starts with Ruth and Naomi in the house. Ruth goes out from the house at Ruth's own instigation. Ruth and Boaz meet in a field, and their interaction there turns the story. And then the end of the chapter, chapter 2, is Ruth and Naomi back in the house, and their dialogue there has transformed Naomi. And by the end of the second act, the plot conflict of the lack of food has been resolved. Chapter 3 is going to do the same thing in the same stamp, but it just kind of scrambles the characters. So, right, you'll have Ruth and Naomi in the house, but it will be Naomi who initiates the action and says, hey, here's what you should do. Then it will be Ruth who goes out of the house. Ruth and Boaz will meet in a field. There'll be an interaction there that will turn the story. Ruth comes back to the house. Ruth and Naomi have an interaction there that will have Naomi one more notch transformed and hopeful, and then it's going to be the beginning of the resolution of the ultimate plot conflict, where the children are going to come from. So just a little flash ahead, but it's, I feel like every time we conclude these studies, I'm up here like losing myself because it's so exciting. You know how many times I've read this story, and you know how small details I just get lost in, and it's like, but the story just as it plays out never gets boring to me. It always is exciting. It's always got this fresh, beautiful, poetic feel to it that just makes you sort of like love these characters and love what's happening there. So I won't apologize. I'll just open up a little bit to you and say, I don't always sound like a giddy little, look what's happening, it's going to be so cool. That's not my style. But, it's fun, man. It really, you get the momentum going and you're like, oh, I want to keep going, but we can't keep going. Our time is up. So let's pick up and we'll burn through chapter 3 next time. Chapter 3, we're going to have to cover a lot of ground, but it's complicated, but it's a lot of fun. And I'll attach the PG-13 rating, possibly R, for all adults, but so you have to come next week. Don't giggle. You have to be serious. It's serious business in chapter 3. All right, Lord, thank you for the time you've given us. Thank you for your word. Send us away with your blessing, we pray. May these things by your Spirit be useful to us, but also transformative for us, and help us to be equipped for the time we've spent here to go out and serve others and reflect your glory. In Christ's name, amen.